Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rising. Sagar, what are we doing today?
Oh, we have an incredible show for everybody today. We've got the authors of an explosive new book on Justice Brett Kavanaugh, part one of Krystal's long interview with Andrew Yang, and some people from over at Chegg to tell us to check in with what the college students are thinking in this election, and of course, the panel to debate what's in the news. All of that coming up today on Rising. Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, yesterday in my exclusive interview with Andrew Yang, he broke news in a big way on one of the major crises of our time. Let me explain. So, no secret to you, dear viewers, that I believe our country is literally disintegrating before our eyes due to a lack of political courage by our so-called leaders. An obvious example of their failings has been the bipartisan war consensus that has led us to endless regime change wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now is pushing us towards war in Iran. Now, one of the reasons, of course, that I admire Senator Sanders is that he had the courage and the foresight to stand against that consensus even when it was not popular. But there's another endless war that has killed far more Americans and destabilized the world. We have lost 800,000 people in this war in the past 30 years alone, and it's cost more every year than offering free child care to every family in America. In my exclusive interview with Andrew Yang, he became the first candidate in 2020 to take an unequivocal stand in favor of ending this war. Take a listen.
I would decriminalize opiates that are being used for personal use and aren't being distributed. So in addition to decriminalizing marijuana, I would decriminalize opiates for personal use.
That's a big deal. I mean, does that include heroin?
Yes, it does. I mean, at this point, what's happened is you had this OxyContin addiction that has morphed into fentanyl and heroin, which are frankly more accessible and sometimes less expensive than the OxyContin that started the addiction chain.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Portugal model, what they've done? Because it's very similar to what you're saying. They essentially decriminalized all drug use, including heroin. They have injection sites where people can go and be dosed, but also have access to treatment rather than being thrown in prison. We're not talking about dealers here. We're talking about individual addicts. I mean, is that consistent with what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I was inspired by Portugal's success, where in the wake of this change in approach, they saw a massive reduction in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates. So I'm for safe injection sites, safe consumption sites, and I'm for referring addicts to treatment instead of jail and letting them know this.
That's right. Andrew Yang has committed to ending the pointless and cruel war on drugs in favor of the Portugal model. In Portugal, simple possession of any drug, including heroin, including cocaine, is not a criminal offense. They don't send people to jail for being addicts, even if the drug they possess is heroin. Instead, they offer treatment, they offer jobs, they offer methadone and other medically based treatment. Portugal's response to catching someone with a 10-day supply of heroin is to offer them help, not jail. And how's that working out for them? Well, Portugal saw its overdose death rate drop 85% since decriminalization, where we lost nearly 70,000 people to opioid overdoses last year alone. Portugal lost 20 people. Now, when I sat down recently with Senator Bernie Sanders, I asked a very similar question, but I received a very different answer.
But I agree with those folks who are moving in the direction of decriminalizing at least marijuana right now.
What about hard drugs, though? I mean, that's the Portugal model.
I'm not there yet. I mean,
Why not?
Because heroin is a killer. You want to push heroin, sorry, I'm not too tolerant to that.
Now, I understand his hesitation. We have been subjected to so much propaganda about the war on drugs that it's hard to accept the truth that prohibition has only pushed people into addiction, putting power into the worst kind of murderous thugs. Nor do I think that Senator Sanders' position is from a lack of political courage. I mean, no man who would advocate allowing currently incarcerated felons to vote is lacking in political courage. Let's just say letting murderers vote isn't exactly a poll-tested position, even though it is, in fact, the right thing to do. So I wanted to lay on a few of the facts on the war on drugs and hope that he and others may be inspired by Andrew Yang's courage and knowledge and evolved to the smart and just position on this issue. So first of all, if you believe that addiction is a public health issue, why are we putting people in jail when they should be receiving treatment? Keep in mind, Heroin was invented by none other than good old Bayer, purveyors of Bayer aspirin. It was actually originally marketed to soothe babies and children nearly 100 years ago. And when it was widely available over the counter, we were not overrun by a nation of zombie heroin addicts. In fact, there were many stable, job-holding, middle-class people who had a mild, manageable heroin addiction. Now, that is certainly not ideal, but it also wasn't killing more Americans than both world wars combined. We criminalized alcohol, heroin, and other drugs in this country early in the last century, and somehow, while we seem to recognize that locking people up during alcohol prohibition was a massive failure that only enriched gangsters and led to grotesque violence, we've yet to learn that lesson about other drugs. In fact, what we did instead was allow Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family to make billions weaponizing a synthetic opioid, OxyContin. But guess what? When your doctor cuts you off of your Oxy prescription after that back injury and you've become addicted, what happens? Many people start buying heroin. Their heroin dealer has no interest in getting them treatment. In fact, he wants to push the biggest dose. That's why fentanyl has become so prolific, and the most addiction that he possibly can. And so we drive people into the arms of these merchants of death rather than offering them the help that they need. This leads to a downward spiral of increasing addiction and criminality to feed their habit. There are about 500,000 people in this country incarcerated today for nonviolent drug offenses, disproportionately, of course, people of color. 500,000 families destroyed. We could have these citizens back and give them the help that they need instead. But even if you don't care about the moral case for decriminalization, remember, if we decriminalize drugs, the Northern Triangle destruction by drug gangs in Honduras and elsewhere would be curtailed. No drug money, no gangs. Nothing could do more to make these countries livable for their citizens, ending the heartbreaking trail of desperate families seeking refuge here. There'd be no narco gang dollars to destabilize Mexico. We wouldn't be funding the Taliban through their shipments of opium, poppy, heroin. We've been attempting to end drug use through prohibition for more than 100 years. And yet here we are, with the worst addiction crisis in our nation's history. It is time to admit this policy has failed. And while full decriminalization may seem radical, what is truly insane is staying the course. So Senator Sanders, please follow the leadership of Andrew Yang here and bring your voice of moral courage and clarity to end the biggest endless war of them all, the war on drugs. We must not let another 800,000 people die needlessly out of propaganda, fear, and big pharma greed. Sagar, I know this is an area where we have a little bit of a different perspective.
We don't have the time to get into it, but what I will say is that the opioid crisis is much more alike to a mass poisoning than it is simply to the demand side. This is China and Mexican drug cartels filling a void, which correctly we've identified has been created by big pharma, but that doesn't mean that we have to just fully decriminalize drugs. A crackdown on the supply through intelligent and correct matters could still very much change this with full rehabilitation. But
we'll
again,
continue this conversation. I'll just say we've been interdicting heroin for 100 years.
You're right, but we haven't been interdicting Chinese fentanyl, which is what is killing us all. Next on Rising, the man, the myth, the champion of math, Andrew Yang. I
sat down with the entrepreneur and presidential hopeful for 30 minutes. We got into a lot, everything from his freedom dividend to his summer reads. We're going to have part one of our conversation next.